Shalom and welcome to our second video on Psalm 23, in which we'll look at two more of God's amazing self-portraits that show us just how devotedly He is looking after us. My name is Murray Salisbury. Although I've taught the Psalms from Hebrew at 4 different universities, this video will not take an academic mind approach. I will share only just a couple of brief insights into the Hebrew words, but I will mainly focus on taking a devotional heart approach, because when we read the Psalms, we have to engage our heart. And Psalm 23 is the world's favorite psalm. Somehow it speaks to the deepest parts of our hearts. We know its language, sort of, without fully understanding it. And when we hear this psalm, it sets off a tuning fork in the core of our being. It stirs up a mysterious hunger in us that we'd forgotten about. It's a longing for belonging to someone far greater than ourselves. It awakens a yearning in us for intimate, heart-to-heart relationship. And at the heart of relationship is love. We love because He first loved us. And He expresses His love for us by caring for us in practical ways. And we express our love back to Him by trusting Him, and also by loving Him, but that's not part of Psalm 23. Without trust, there is no real relationship. So I believe that when God inspired Psalm 23, He had this question in mind: will you trust me to take care of you? Though He doesn't even use that word trust in the psalm, what God really wants to do through this psalm is to grow our confidence in Him. Instead of explicitly asking us this question, He simply wants to show you His heart for you. And as soon as God opens our eyes to see what is His heart attitudes towards us, it changes everything. We've seen this already in Psalm 23, 1-4. God's heart is to shepherd you. His heart is full of unfailing love towards you, of His constant care for you. And now in verses 5-6, we also see that God's heart is to host us. And once again, we see that His heart is full of constant care for us. Now in self-portrait number 1, we saw that God is our caring shepherd. So we read together, "The Lord is my shepherd, so I lack nothing. He lets me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the right paths for His name's sake. And though I walk in a dark ravine, I will fear no evil, because You are with me. Your rod and staff comfort me." And now we're turning to portrait number 2. God is my caring host. You prepare a table before me, openly, before my haters. You refresh my head with oil. My cup is full up. Nothing but Your goodness and Your constant care pursue me every day of my life. I will dwell in the Lord's house for all my days. So the word host is not actually found in the text, but it is implied by all these words for hosting: table, preparing a table, preparing a feast, refreshing someone's head with oil, and that's to welcome them, isn't it? And filling up their cups, and the word house as well. So these are hospitality words, and hospitality is a big thing in that part of the world. As your caring host, God wants you to feel really good about being in His house and being looked after by Him. God wants you to feel wanted at His table. He wants you to feel provided for, refreshed, honored by Him, and special to Him. And God wants you to feel safe and secure. In other words, that those who hate you cannot harm you in His presence. And He wants you to feel loved and cherished. relentlessly pursued by his generosity and his loving care, and he wants you to feel welcome, to live in his presence at all times. You all come back now, you hear? He wants you to come back. He wants you to feel very welcome at any time. So the two halves of the Psalm 23, basically says very much the same thing in different ways. In God's first self-portrait, we find that God is our caring shepherd, and that means that I am his sheep. So I'm vulnerable, I'm needy, I'm submitted to him as my shepherd, and I'm totally dependent on his care. And then in self-portrait number 2, God is my caring host, he's my overlord king, and I am his foreign guest, probably a foreigner, and very probably a king or an important person back home, but way out of my depth here at his court. So therefore I feel vulnerable, needy, submitted to his overlordship, and totally dependent on his care once again. And remember the two core beliefs that Satan always wants to attack in us: what we believe God is like and what we believe God thinks about us. So what is God like? He's our devoted and attentive caregiver. And further down here is not what he thinks of us, that is more what we need to admit that we are like, so that we place ourselves under his care. What does he think of us? Well, he thinks we are worthy of his care and of his attention. So in God's first self-portrait, in verses 1 to 4, he makes 4 promises to care for us. He promises you his presence, he promises you his provision, he promises you his providence, and he also promises you his protection. And implied behind all of that is his constant care, although it's not explicitly found until verse 6. The whole poem kind of builds up towards this single word in Hebrew, constant care, or chesed in Hebrew. It's a psalm of David, who was a shepherd, and while he was out there caring for his father's sheep, God inspired him to see him as caring for him just like a shepherd does, that God is his shepherd. So God reveals to him that he is his shepherd looking after him. And now we come to verses 5 and 6, the second inspired portrait, self-portrait by God, and it comes from David's last career, basically, as a powerful overlord king who hosted and protected his vassal kings. And while he was caring for these vassal kings, God inspired him to see him as caring for him just like he does, as a powerful overlord king. So how did a shepherd boy become king? While he was still a shepherd boy, when God sought him and found him, and he twice called him something that he never said about anyone else in the whole Bible, he says, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. Which means that David wanted to do what God wanted him to do, that David wanted what God wanted. And it goes on to explain it here, doesn't it? When Paul quotes it in Acts, he says, he will do everything I want him to do. So it explains what that means, a man after God's heart. So David's heart was set on the purposes of God's heart. And so that is why Paul, as he continues his sermon in Acts 13, goes on to say David had served God's purposes in his own generation. So because David had spent time with God, he could tune his own heart to God's heart, so that his own heart wanted what God's heart wanted. He could only do that by spending time with him. And even as a boy, he did that. He followed his shepherd right on the heels of the shepherd, didn't he? Now, as a boy, David didn't seem to be liked by his own family. Even his own father had excluded him when presenting his sons before Samuel, the prophet. But God didn't want Samuel to anoint any of his older brothers as kings, so Samuel had to ask, "Are these all the sons that you have?" "Well, there is the youngest," David's father replied. "But we make sure he stays out there in the fields watching the sheep and the goats. That's all he's good for." Well, Samuel seemed to get a bit angry at this point. He said, "Send for him at once. We will not sit down to eat until he arrives." So it seems to me anyway that he was no longer welcome to live in their house, no longer wanted at their table, and not even for a special feast where Samuel was providing enough meat for everybody. And we see that David's older brothers, their attitudes towards him in the next chapter as well. We all have a longing for belonging to family, to the in-group, to someone far bigger than ourselves. And we can only imagine how healing it must have been for David's sense of rejection when he came to realize that he was welcome at God's table and in his house forever. So David was no stranger to social distancing, not self-isolation, but it was imposed on him by his own family when he was probably just a young teen, if not before. It appears that they simply didn't want him around. He was no doubt very precocious as a child, so they sent him out to look after the sheep day and night, a job that they could have given to a hired shepherd, as they did when they sent David with food to the front line. And this painful rejection is why he penned these words in Psalm 27, "For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in." And there's stinging irony in the meaning of his name as well. It means loved one, beloved. Beloved by his family he was not, nor by his first employer, or his second employer after the family, I guess, by King Saul. He was no longer wanted in the workplace, no longer welcome at the king's table, because King Saul had become very jealous of him, of his successes. You can't do anything about other people's envy. The only thing to do is to focus on God's true view of you, which is what David does here in verse 5, which says, "You prepare a table before me." So David can think, I belong. I'm welcome. And more than that, I'm even honored by God, because you even arrange a feast in my honor. It's not just preparing a table, but a table, not just preparing his own table, but preparing a table before me, David says. You're making a feast in my honor. So the word here for before in this line is literally to the face of, and it can sometimes mean in the presence of. It means right in front of, as it does here in this line. But it's actually the only way to say in the presence of in Hebrew, because there's no word for presence in Hebrew. They literally use the word face. So whenever you see the word presence in the Old Testament, it's always this word face in Hebrew. Every time, except in this verse, many translations still say, in the presence of my enemies, instead of openly before my enemies, like the meaning really is, because it's not that word presence or face there in this line. It's a different word completely, which means to do something openly, in plain view of, in plain sight of. It's sometimes translated that way by other translations. So in the presence of, it doesn't mean that they're sitting right opposite you, right in your face, as it were. The meaning of this word is explained for us nicely in another passage here, another verse. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing openly before all Israel and openly before the Son. So that makes it clear what the meaning is, and it's very likely the case that all Israel were not in the tent with Absalom when he was in the tent with his father's concubines, but it was done openly enough for them to know what was going on. And it's the same here as well. They're not sitting right opposite you at the table. So this is not the picture. Your enemies are not sitting right in front of you, making nasty comments, accusing you, making you feel like a fraud and that you don't really belong, spoiling the happiness of the occasion for you, even making you drop your cup. This is not the picture. So in the darkness, don't practice the presence of your enemies. Don't listen to the darkness. Don't listen to your own self-talk. The only view of you that matters is God's view of you, because God's view of you is the only true view of you. And just as light dispels darkness, so the truth of how God sees you will dispel all the false views of you that you have taken into your soul, into your sense of identity, what you believe in your core to be true about you. So far from exposing you to the ridicule of your enemies, your powerful and good host is actually protecting you from them. He's saying, in effect, something like this: you mess with him, you mess with me. So if they are at the feast at all, they are somewhere out of sight, but they're probably not even there. So what this line is actually saying is, he protects me. He signals to these enemies that I'm under his strong protection. He's doing this invitation and this feast, honoring me openly before those who hate me. And this translation uses the word haters because they're not enemies in the sense that I don't like them. It's these people are opposing me. They are hating me without cause, without reason, as David says very often in the Psalms. So it's about protection, this verse. So that's you sitting there beside the powerful king on his right side in the place of honor. And if there are any enemies, they're sitting further away. So your good host may not have even invited them to your party, but they get to know about it somehow. And it goes on to say, you refresh my head with oil, or literally you rub my head with oil, because it's not the same word for to anoint a king or a priest. So there's fragrant olive oil to refresh you after your journey. The purpose is also to honor you as a guest, to welcome you as a guest. And a good host will do that as soon as you arrive in the house. And you remember the story about Simon the Pharisee, who was not a good host on that occasion anyway, in the New Testament. And the verse goes on to say, my cup overflows, or my cup is full up. It's the same word as in Psalm 66:12. You have brought us out to a place of abundance. So it's literally, my cup is abundance, literally. But overflows is a wonderful poetic way of saying it. It's sort of exaggerated poetic language, isn't it? Probably wasn't making a mess on the table, but it's that kind of idea of you never run out of God's blessings. His blessings overflow. So attentive hosts keep refilling cups before they even get down to halfway or even 3/4 of the way. And so this is provision. And the antidote to wanting more is to look into our own cup and to realize that we have enough. And to realize that having enough is enough. We don't have to try to make sure that we have enough for the future. All we need is enough for now. And all we need to know is that he is generous. His generosity is always hovering over our cup, eager to pour in more as soon as it goes down just a little bit, ready to fill it up to overflowing once again. You might have heard of FOMO. How about FORO? Fear of running out. I lack nothing, says David. My cup overflows, says David. We don't have to fear running out because God is always enough. His grace is always sufficient and his blessings are always abundant. So I'm not going to look into your cup or somebody else's cup because mine is already more than full. It's overflowing. So we are rich in ways that really matter. Our identity, our self-worth, our value, our security, our significance, having community, having relationship with God, having meaning and purpose in life, and having love in our community and with God. These are the things that matter, and we get these things by sitting, God and you, at table together, or in the grassy meadows, or by the quiet streams, in the mundane, in the ordinary. That's where we'd learn the blessedness of our life, how full our cup is, so it's providence as well, isn't it? Because cup means our lot in life, as well as a literal cup. And then the next verse says, surely your goodness. To trust God is to believe that he is good all the time. And until you believe that God is good all the time, you're never going to be able to fully trust him. And that's why we need to spend time getting to know him, that he is good. And it goes on to say, and unfailing love, New Living Translation. To trust God is also to believe that he loves us. That word for unfailing love used to be translated as steadfast love, and that's because it is a kind of committed love, a loyal love, faithful love, a devoted love. It's also a practical love. And for English speakers, love is a feeling. We can fall in love and out of love. For Hebrew speakers, love is a commitment. And love is very practical. So it's constant care. It's practical care, especially to those who really need it. So sheep and foreigners are good pictures of the kinds of people who need God's chesed. So are you a candidate for chesed, or are you stubbornly holding on to the illusion of your independence and self-sufficiency? So we have two choices, don't we, when we feel fearful? Either trust or control. And control includes running away, hiding, or fighting and striving. And the reason we want to go to control instead of trust is that we don't really believe that we are loved. And that is 1 John. To trust God is to believe that he loves us, and that is Psalm 23. So to know that God loves us needs to become our deepest core belief. That he loves us in that caring way, and we show our love back to him by trusting and by obeying. Obeying isn't really part of Psalm 23, but trusting certainly is. So loving care and trust and loving trust. Believing specifically that he is taking good care of us, trusting in his care. Do we trust him to take care of us? So that's how a relationship with God works. God's love for us is a resolute, stubborn, unconditional kind of love that pursues us until he catches up with us. It is a faithful, loyal love that never gives up. And Psalm 23 builds up to this last verse where we find one of the most beautiful pictures in the whole Bible of God's love chasing after each and every one of us, relentlessly pursuing us. Because that is what it says, like the New Living Translation says, surely your goodness and your unfailing love will pursue me, says David. And it is that word for chasing after, for hunting down, for catching up with. It's used of predators, it's used of enemy soldiers chasing after you. Only here is it used in a positive sense. So it's that word for pursue. And the English word follow seems very weak to me. Because what God is saying here is, I don't just passively follow along behind you. I chase you down. I relentlessly never give up on you, and I pursue you until I catch up with you so that I can embrace you in my goodness and envelop you in my loving care. Yes, I go before you, I precede you to prepare the way, but I also chase after you. And that is the picture that I believe is very powerful. God is my hunter. He's my caring hunter because he chases me with his goodness and with his unfailing love. But he's my hunter, as well as my host and as well as my shepherd. So it is one of the most powerful images of God in the whole Bible. And it's such a pity that most English translations use the word follow for this mind-blowing self-portrait. And it kind of speaks of providence as well, doesn't it? He pursues us as well as precedes us. So one of the certainties of God's character is his providence. He works out his good purposes for us, and he even leaves the 99 to come look for us if needed. So that's the certainty, and that's why we have this word surely. Surely he does pursue us. And for David, he was pursued by Saul's men for probably about 9 years, all of his 20s, from age 21 through to 30, when he became king. But now David is saying, as he looks back, it was really only God's goodness and his unfailing love that was pursuing me. Because that word for surely can mean surely, it can mean only, and it's translated both ways. And it can mean both, and I believe here it means both. Sometimes the word is translated as nothing but as well. And I believe that's a good way to translate it here. Surely only, or nothing but, your generous care. No enemies, no evil, but nothing but your generous care has been pursuing me. Every day of my life, says David. So it's as if David is looking back on his life and he's saying now, if there had been no enemies in my life, no dark ravine that I had to go through, then I may not look back behind over my shoulder. Whenever I hear footsteps and heavy breathing and look back to see who is chasing me, every time it was God's providence, God's way of bringing me back into greater blessing, ultimately, in the end, into even more of his generous care. Because that's what that word goodness means as well, isn't it? It means generosity. Very often it's translated that way elsewhere in the Bible. And David is saying it's his generosity or his goodness and his unfailing love that was chasing me. Only that, and not those enemies, actually. Because they didn't catch up to me. Only God can catch up with us, because you can't outrun God, as Jonah found out. He'll even use a whale to chase us down and to bring us back to where we are supposed to be, where we are supposed to be heading and what we are supposed to be doing. So you are pursued by God's providence and by his goodness and by his unfailing love, by his kindness and by his grace. And if you, like David, don't feel like you belong, don't feel like you fit, then Psalm 23 tells us that there is a place where we fit perfectly, and that is in his presence. You are included at his table. You belong in his house. So what stops you from being in his embrace, from coming close so that he can embrace you? In a way you are there, but what stops you from experiencing it? What are you afraid of? Well, he understands. He knows you've been hurt by the significant others in your life. He knows you, he gets you. He knows what makes you tick. He knows the good and the bad and the ugly. He knows all about you, but his love for you is infinite and unchangeable all the same. So all I can say to you is spend time with him and get to know him. Practice his presence. And that is the last part of the psalm, where David says, I will dwell in the Lord's house. He's actually saying, he's not actually predicting the future. This is what's going to happen. Sometimes when we read the word will in the Bible, it's talking about the future, but sometimes it's talking about a choice. Like in the book of Joshua, it says, choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's a choice. It's a way of saying, this is what we are going to do. And although many translations say forever, I will dwell in the Lord's house forever, there are many ways of saying forever in Hebrew, but this is not one of them. The expression here, for the duration of my days, is parallel to for all the days of my life that we find earlier in the same verse. And both of these refer to life here on earth, in the here and now, not in eternity. And even the word days by itself regularly refers to earthly life. So it is about living in his presence right here and right now. But in Hebrew poetry, it's not a matter of either or, but both and very often. So I'm not going to eliminate the other meaning of eternity. You can hold on to that if you like, as a faith statement about living in heaven for eternity. But it's really about practicing his presence in the here and now. And that's his faith choice that he makes here. So David puts the certainty of God's presence right at the start of his poem and right at the heart of his poem. Right in the middle of his poem, in the midst of his difficulty, in the midst of that dark ravine, God puts his presence there as well. And also at the end. So it's at the beginning and the end of his poem is the idea that God is always present with him. And in the in-between is where he was able to practice his presence. And it's in the mundane and the ordinary where we can practice his presence as well. If we spend time with our shepherd in the ordinary, in the in-between, like in the green pastures, as we learnt last time, and beside quiet waters, in the right paths, then when we get to the dark ravine, we find that we will experience his presence there with us as well. And we can say, I will fear no evil. I will trust him in the darkness. And it's the same in the second half of the poem. We've got his presence at the beginning, in verse 4, his presence at the end, and then in the middle we practice his presence in the mundane, in the sitting at table with him, like his disciples did. God and man at table are set down. God and man in the boat are crossing the lake. God and man are walking together down the path of life. That's where we practice his presence. So my heart response to the first half is to practice his presence and to trust him in the crisis. My heart response in the second half of the psalm is to practice his presence also, and to practice the presence of his provision, of his protection, of his providence. My cup is full up, my lot in life is full, and to practice the presence of his constant care, which is pursuing me, chasing after me every day of my life. So you know these by now. We've added now a fifth one, constant care, or chesed, unfailing love. And as we meditate on those things, our trust grows. And we're familiar by now with the two core beliefs that are under attack. So every time we read a psalm, we should ask these two questions. What does it teach me about what God is like? What does it teach me about what God thinks of me? Every time we read a psalm, ask those two questions. Now I'll finish with this, because it's not actually very easy to think about these abstract concepts like presence, provision, providence, protection. It's not very easy to feel them when we use abstract nouns like those. So that is the reason why God used picture language, and it's because he wants us to feel them. He wants us to engage our hearts. So I'm going to finish with this. What is God's heart for you? Another way of asking that is, what does God want you to feel as a result of hearing this psalm? Because the heart is all about wanting and it's all about feeling. And the Psalms are all about the heart. It's all about what God wants, what we want, and it's all about what God feels about us, what we feel. And so that's a very important question to ask with the Psalms. What does God want you to feel about Psalm 23? Well, he wants you to feel wanted and included at his table of fellowship. He wants you to feel safe and secure in his powerful presence, that those who hate you cannot harm you. He wants you to feel provided for, refreshed and honored and special in his presence. He wants you to feel blessed by his overflowing abundance. He wants you to feel loved and cherished and cared for, completely cared for. And he wants you to feel relentlessly pursued by his generosity and by his loving care. And he wants you to feel welcome, to live in his presence at all times, every day and every moment of every day, to live in his presence. So that is what God's heart is for you from these two verses of Psalm 23. If you want to hear his heart for you from the whole psalm, check out the third video on Psalm 23. No teaching at all, just listening to his heart and receiving his revelation of truth and his affirmations for you. So see you in the next video.